Have you ever witnessed a person whose entire youth was scarred and stood at the threshold of changing their life with just one choice? That was Clara, a woman who survived long years of being imprisoned in fear, struggling against violence and loneliness. Then one winter day she knocked on the door of a remote farmhouse where there was only wind, snow, and a silent man with eyes of a lifetime of loneliness. If it were you, would you dare to bet your fate one last time? Would you dare to trust a hand that doesn't say much but always reaches out at the right time? Do you have the courage to step out of the darkness when the past still chases you until your last breath? This story begins with adversity, but leads us to a choice that we have all faced, to believe or not to believe again. Join me on that journey where love is quiet but strong enough to change a life. If you are willing to listen, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that Clara and Eli's journey can begin in your heart. That morning the sky was like a gray woolen blanket covering the vast plains. The electric poles along the railway line shook slightly in the wind, emitting a hoarse sound like someone groaning in a fitful sleep. The heavy iron train exhaled white smoke, then slowly rolled out of Billings Station, pulling a series of old cars that swayed like memories trying to escape the past. Clara Sutton clutched the small canvas bag tightly in her arms and looked out the window. The wind blew through the cracks in the glass, enough to make her thin shoulders hunched. But what made her shiver was not the wind, but the feeling that she was going to a place where even fate could not predict. She answered an ad for a mail-order bride in an old newspaper. A letter from a man named Elias Ward. A complete stranger. A place she had never heard of, Sheridan Ridge, Wyoming. And a promise. Brief but strange enough to make her pause longer than any promise in her life. In that letter he only wrote, "I ask nothing of you. I only want someone who will help me keep the farm from getting too cold." The wind blows louder than human words here. Low stow. No sweet talk. No pleading. No promises of paradise. But it was the first word in Clara's life that made her not feel pressured. The metal creaked as the train banked around the curve. The railroad wound between bare hills dotted with old wagons like scars from the early West. Every now and then Clara caught a glimpse of distant farms, their roofs dusty, their horses and sheep standing still in the wind. She touched her neck where a small silver cross hung from a thin chain. It was the only thing her mother had left her before her life fell into the hands of Jonas Keene, the man who had strangled her childhood like an old tin can. Jonas was more than a stepfather. He ruled Camp Laurel Creek, a coal camp filled with the smell of black dust where children were treated as nothing more than tools for profit. Clara grew up surrounded by yelling, by falling down coal shafts, by winters so cold that her skin cracked and no one gave her any ointment. She had believed she would die in Laurel Creek like the other women Jonas forced into labor who never had a chance to escape. But when Clara was 34 on a snowy winter night, as the wind howled around the cliffs behind the camp, she ran away. With only her bare hands, an old coat, and a courage she didn't know she had. Exist. Not live. Just exist. Until today's train. The loudspeaker sounded urgent but tired. "We'll stop at Sheridan Ridge in 40 minutes. Clara took a deep breath. Her hands were shaking so much that she had to clutch the edges of her dress so no one would see. She wanted to believe that stopping at Sheridan Ridge would be a new beginning, but another voice inside her coldly asked, what guarantees that the man isn't like Jonas? What guarantees that he needs a wife and not a free worker? Clara closed her eyes. She didn't believe in men. She didn't believe in marriage. She didn't believe in promises. But the only thing she believed was that she could not return to the place that had imprisoned her throughout her youth. The train slowed. The scenery outside the window began to take shape. Timbered houses, a small bell tower, icy streets, a few shop signs. A desolate land but warm with life. Sheridan Ridge, the destination of all remaining hope. When the train stopped, Clara stood up, her legs a little stiff from the long journey. People began to disembark, families seeking new lives, men trailing behind with horses, women carrying goods in small wagons. Step by step, Clara walked down to the platform. The cold air cut into her face, but it also made her more alert. The crowd passed by. Everyone was busy with his own business. No one paid any attention to the woman in the gray cotton dress and the frayed cape. Clara swallowed. She had been thinking about this scene the whole journey. Will he really come? Then her eyes fell on a figure standing at the edge of the platform, tall, silent as a shadow on this very winter afternoon. A man in an old Stetson, a dark brown leather jacket, his boots caked with road dust, standing next to a small wagon loaded with bales of hay. He didn't walk towards her, didn't stare, didn't wave, just stood there as if to give Clara enough space to step forward if she wanted to. Voluntary. No coercion. Clara stood still, her heart beating irregularly. The man inclined his head slightly, then took a step toward her. Just one step. Enough to indicate that he recognized her, but no more. His voice was low, slow, and slightly hoarse from the wind. "If you are Clara Sutton, then I am Elias Ward." She took a deep breath of cold air, but somehow felt strangely warm inside. All the answers to the questions she had been asking herself during the train ride seemed to disappear in that moment. Elias Ward was unlike any man in her life, at least in the way he kept his distance, as if knowing that her boundaries were sacred. Clara nodded slightly, her voice as small as the wind. "Yes, I am Clara." Eli didn't ask any more questions, didn't probe, didn't judge, just reach out, but stop halfway. "Do you want to carry your own luggage?" he asked in a tone Clara had never heard from a man, a respectful tone. She nodded. Eli also nodded, then withdrew his hand, gently turned and led her to the wagon. As Clara followed him, she suddenly realized the wind was no longer blowing as cold as when the ship had just docked. Or has her heart changed? The afternoon wind in Sheridan Ridge had a distinct smell, a mix of snowgrass, pine smoke, and a touch of dry western dust. Clara sat next to Eli in the small wagon, the tires rolling smoothly through the thin layer of snow on the road leading out of town. Each squeak of the tires reminded Clara that she was moving away from the past, but not close enough to the future. Eli drove the pair of horses with unusual calm. He did not say much. During the whole trip, he only occasionally asked, "Are you cold, or is it comfortable sitting like that?" Every sentence was short. Every sentence was slow. Every sentence was considered before being spoken. Clara had met many types of men in her life. Loud, rough, self-centered. But Eli was the opposite, silent, as a mountain calm, as a lake without wind. It was that kind of silence that made Clara a little uneasy, not because she was afraid, but because she was not used to it. People are silent when they are hiding something. People are silent when they are calculating. People are silent when they want to take the initiative. Clara had understood silence in very dark ways. But Eli was silent in a different way. She felt it, though she couldn't name it. The wagon drove through a meadow so vast Clara could not see where it ended. In the distance, snow-capped mountains towered like ancient gods. The wind blew through the meadow, making the ground look like moving water ripples in the pale yellow light. "It's so beautiful here this time of year," Clara blurted out, then started to scold herself for breaking Eli's peace. But Eli just turned slightly, his gray eyes like morning dew looking at her for a moment. "Yes, winters here are cold, but it's not cruel. It's just straightforward." "You know," Clara hesitated. "I am not sure." Eli nodded as if he had expected that answer. "You'll see. Sheridan Ridge is cold, but the people are kind. Laurel Creek." He stopped. Didn't ask any more questions. Didn't make her tell him. Didn't bring up the pain. That surprised Clara more than being asked directly. He knew she had a wounded past, but he did not touch that wound. No one had ever given her that kind of respect before. The sun was setting behind the mountains. As the wagon turned onto a small road, Clara saw a log house perched on a hill surrounded by a fence made of old planks. Beside the house was a stable and a hay barn built of sturdy pine boards. Though simple, the house exuded a peace Clara had never known before. Not a false peace, but the peace of someone who had known loss and chosen to stand up again. Eli got down first, holding out his hand as if to help her, but holding it halfway, waiting for her to decide. Clara looked at the hand, strong, work-worn, and gently placed her own on it. His hand was warmer than she thought. "Slow down," Eli said. It was simple, but it sounded sincere. Clara walked down, her eyes stopping at the front door. On the door hung a wind chime made from an old silver spoon. Every time the wind blew, it made a gentle sound like the soft laughter of someone who had stopped being sad for a long time. "It's a small farm," Eli said, "but you'll be safe here." The word safe made Clara pause. In Laurel Creek, safety was a luxury more precious than money. There, people got by avoiding the eyes of the most powerful. There, a small mistake could result in a beating that would leave someone bedridden for a week. Clara looked at Eli for a long moment. He stood straight, his eyes unwavering. No coaxing, No pity. Just real. Thank you, she said, her voice small but not shaking like before. Eli nodded slightly as if her thanks were not just for him, but for this entire house, for the wind blowing through, for the path she had bravely traveled to get here. Inside the house was warmer than Clara had expected. A small fire was burning in the kitchen. The smell of pine, earth, and simple leftovers from lunch made the air homey. Clara stood in the kitchen looking at the small wooden table with two neatly placed chairs, the old-fashioned cupboard by the window, and the photograph of a woman with silvery black hair hanging on the wall. She had just laid eyes on the photo when Eli said from behind her, "That's my mother. She died 4 years ago." "I am sorry," Clara said softly. He shook his head. "No need to apologize. She lived her whole life here and died peacefully. I think she would have liked you." Clara felt a little embarrassed by that statement. No one had ever said they thought their loved ones would like her. Clara always felt like she was just being a nuisance. Eli continued, "I've made a room for you. You can lock the door if you like. The key is on the handle." Again, Clara paused. "You have the key ready for me?" "Yes. I think everyone deserves a door that listens to them. A listening door." An image so strange and beautiful that it made Clara's chest ache. The bedroom was not large but clean. The bed was made of solid wood, the blanket was thick, and the window faced a field as wide as a map of the blue sky. Clara put down her bag and sat on the bed. She heard Eli come down the stairs. She heard wood being added to the stove. She heard him feed the horses in the yard. The sounds blended together, creating a silence that Clara had never experienced before. A silence that made her mind wonder, can I trust this place? Can I trust the man? Or is this just the calm before the storm? She lay down, forcing those thoughts into the deepest part of her heart. But the last question remained. Do I have the courage to live a new life? Or do I just run? That evening, Eli placed a pot of hot stew on the table along with 2 old but clean china bowls. He did not invite with flowery words, but simply said, "You eat first. I can eat later." Clara shook her head. "No, let's eat together." Eli looked at her longer than usual. There was something light in his gaze, like the wind blowing across a mountaintop before dusk. Then he sat down and poured her a cup of warm water. The meal was simple, but to Clara it was like the first food she had ever eaten without fear of being yelled at or having it snatched away midway. Eli ate slowly, not making a loud sound. So did Clara. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was like a wall slowly being built from empathetic bricks. When they finished eating, Eli said, "You're tired today. Take it easy. Tomorrow I'll show you some light work around the farm. No rush." Clara nodded slightly. It was a long day, but it was the first day I felt like I could still live. Eli did not reply, but his eyes spoke for themselves. Night falls. The wind blows through the fields like the endless sigh of the great forest. Clara lay on her bed, her hand on her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't jump when the wind changed direction. She didn't flinch when the door creaked slightly in the wind. She gently touched the key in her hand, and in the darkness, the familiar loneliness in her heart lessened a little. Just a little, but enough for her to know that her journey had begun. The first morning at Ward Farm began with the distant call of a rooster, slow and steady, a reminder that the western sun always rises on time. Soft yellow light filtered through Clara's small window, casting a soft shadow over the brown wool blanket like a hug that did not touch the skin. Clara opened her eyes and needed a moment to remember where she was. No more Laurel Creek. No more shouting. No more Jonas's booze-scented breath right next to her face. Just the breeze brushing against the glass and the sound of horses in the stables rubbing against the wood. She sat up, her hands unconsciously reaching up to fix her loose bun, and she realized, last night, she had slept through the night, without waking up. That has not happened in more than 10 years. Clara washed her face with warm water from the wooden basin, rolled up her sleeves, and walked down the stairs. The wooden stairs creaked slightly, but the sound didn't scare her. It was more like the house saying good morning. In the kitchen, Eli was standing by the stove, stirring a large pot of oatmeal. He heard footsteps, but did not turn around immediately. Only when Clara came closer did he slowly say, "Good morning." His voice was low, a little hoarse from the cold wind, but pleasant to hear, like the sound of earth after rain. "Good morning, Clara," replied, her hands clasped together slightly, still a little awkward. Eli pointed to the chair next to the table. "Sit down. I made some coffee." Clara looked at the cream-colored porcelain cup. He had placed another one for her, as if he was used to her being there. Just a small sign, but it softened her heart. She sat down, her hands wrapped around the warm cup of coffee. The steam rose, carrying a strong, warm, slightly bitter smell. She had never had breakfast with anyone in Laurel Creek. Never had anyone prepared it for her. She raised the cup to her lips and took a sip. "Thank you for everything," Clara said without looking directly at Eli. Eli did not answer immediately. He put down his spoon, picked up the pot, brought it to the table, and then said, "You don't need to thank me. Here, everyone has their own place." Simple words, but like the first promise in this place. During breakfast, Clara took a closer look at the house. Honey-colored pine walls, bookshelves in the corner with a few old novels, a piece of unfinished embroidery on a table by the fireplace, and a man's coat hanging neatly by the door, not messy, not loose. Neat but not cold. A house with a lifestyle, with a past, but it doesn't imprison anyone. Clara took courage and asked, "Can I help? I don't want to be a burden." Eli stopped eating and put down his spoon. He looked at her non-judgmentally. "You're not a burden, but if you want to do something to get used to it, then do whatever you feel comfortable doing." "Pleasant," Clara repeated in her head. The concept was so foreign that she had to think for a few seconds. Eli continued, "There's some light work in the stables, but only if you want to. No one's forcing you to do anything." She nodded slightly, her heart filled with gratitude. In the afternoon, Eli led Clara to the stables. The stable door creaked open, revealing two large horses. One was jet black, its eyes as deep as the mountain night. The other was reddish-brown, its posture as gentle as an autumn afternoon. "This is Jack, and that is Maple," Eli introduced. Clara stood a few steps away from them, a little afraid but also attracted by their calm demeanor. Eli did not force her closer. He just put his hand on Jack's back, gently stroking the horse's spine. "They know who's shaking. They don't hurt innocent people." The way he spoke was like he was talking about himself. Clara moved a little closer, hesitantly, reaching out her hand to Maple. The horse gently nuzzled her hand, then touched her palm with its snout. She shivered slightly, not from fear but from the sheer trust the animal felt. Eli looked at her, the eyes of one who knew much about silence and fear. "You did well." Clara bowed her head to hide the small smile that suddenly appeared on her lips. They worked together all afternoon. Eli mowed the lawn, Clara gathered firewood. As the sky darkened, a wind blew from the mountains, carrying with it the chill of the coming snow. Clara pulled her coat closer. Eli handed her a thick woolen scarf to wrap around her neck. "It's too cold and your lungs will hurt," he said, his voice low, like the advice of a familiar person. Clara looked at him longer than necessary. A strange feeling welled up in her. The feeling of being cared for without asking for anything in return. She said awkwardly, "I'm not used to being treated like this." Eli stood still, his eyes seeming to see through the pain Clara hid in every breath. "Here people are not here to hurt each other," he replied. "The saying is not philosophy, just a fact." That evening they had a simple meal, toast bacon and baked beans. Eli didn't talk about his past, and Clara didn't ask. A respect they both understood. When she stood up to wash the dishes, Eli stopped her. "I can do it." "You rest." Clara shook her head. "Let me do it. I want to get used to being here." Eli thought for a few seconds, then nodded. No arguing, no trying to be gallant, just respecting her decision. While she washed the dishes, Clara heard Eli shoveling wood into the fireplace, the soft creak of the shutters, his breathing as he carried the load of wood. The sounds blended into a daily music Clara never knew she could appreciate. When she reached her room, Clara paused a long time before the door. Years of living in Laurel Creek had made it a habit to lock her door every night. But tonight she hesitated, not because she trusted Eli completely, but because she sensed that in this house, there were walls that kept quiet. Finally, she locked the door, but gently, not in a hurry, not trembling. One small step, but for Clara, it's a long way. She lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Her eyes closed, but her mind was open to new worries. "Can I stay here?" Is Eli really a good person? Or will one day everything fall apart like the last time? She turned, pulling the blanket up to her neck. It took Clara a long moment to understand that the fear hadn't gone away. It was just learning to be quiet, like the man downstairs. And that could be the start of something. Not love, too soon to name. Not safety, too fragile to confirm. But maybe there is hope. The second morning at the Ward farm began softly, the steady thump of sawing wood on the front porch. Clara woke in the pale blue light of a winter dawn, her hair tangled on her pillow like backwinded hay. She sat up and listened. The axe beat steadily, no irritation, no grumbling. Just the sound of a man working to prepare for the day. Clara put on her coat and went downstairs. The house was colder than yesterday, but neat and clean. In the kitchen there was a note next to the coffee pot in Eli's simple handwriting. Fresh coffee. I'm outside. Clara touched the paper as if it were something precious. Not because the message was special, but because no one had ever left a message for her like that before. Quietly, but kindly, she poured coffee into her cup, cupped it in her hands, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning wind was chilly, but the sun was struggling to rise over the mountains, bathing the valley in a golden light as fine as cornmeal. Eli was lining up the split logs in 2 neat rows. His shoulders were broad, his posture was steady. Each swing of his axe moved his entire body like a strong yet gentle current. Clara leaned against the door and watched for a long moment, knowing she shouldn't stare too long, but unable to look away. Eli stopped and turned to look at her for a second. He didn't ask why she was up early. He didn't ask why she was standing there watching. He just nodded slightly in greeting. A small gesture, but it made Clara feel truly seen. She stepped closer, keeping a comfortable distance. "Can I help you?" Clara asked. Eli wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "If you want, you can help me collect the wood chips and put them in the bin." Gently. "Okay," Clara replied, genuinely wanting to help. She bent down and picked up the small pieces of wood. They were rough and sharp, but they felt real, unlike the cold metal of Laurel Creek. The smell of pine reminded her of the rare days as a child when her mother was still alive, building a pine stove to cook soup. The memory was as light as the old wool coat her mother had once made. Eli said as he continued chopping, "If you get tired, stop immediately. No one expects you to overwork yourself." Clara smiled softly. "I'm used to much heavier things." Eli looked at her, his eyes serious. "Familiar doesn't mean right." The word stabbed Clara's heart like a gentle knife. They didn't hurt her, but they made her understand that Eli had seen something she was trying to hide. An old crack. Something deep. She looked down, avoiding his eyes. After work, they went inside and Eli made more coffee. Clara sat down across from him, warming the cup. Eli did not stare, did not ask for conversation. He just sat there, his large hands holding the ceramic cup, his eyes looking out the window. His silence made Clara feel safe, unscrutinized. But in that silence, Clara also saw something else. Eli had something he didn't say. A private pain. An untold story. A dark place he kept to himself, the way he kept his boots neatly by the door. Clara asked slowly, "Have you lived alone?" For long, Eli was not startled by the question. He answered slowly, as if choosing his words. "It's been a while." "Because your mother died?" Clara asked again, her voice soft. A moment of silence. Not because of discomfort, but because he thought before sharing. Then Eli said, "She was the last of my family. This house used to have 4 people. My father died in a storm. My younger brother didn't like this life. Left, never came back." His voice became deeper when he mentioned his younger brother. Clara heard what Eli did not say. He waited. But the wait was answered only by the wind. "And you?" Clara asked. "Why are you still here?" Eli put down his cup and looked out the window where the wind blew rays of light onto the table. "Because someone has to stay. To keep this house. To keep the land. To keep what my father believed in." Clara suddenly felt her heart shrink. For the first time she saw a little bit of loneliness in Eli. But not the kind of loneliness that makes people cruel. Rather the kind of loneliness that makes them thoughtful, that makes them respect the pain of others. She understood why he didn't say much. He had lost so much that words were sometimes not enough. At lunch, Clara decided to make her own lunch. She made a simple vegetable soup and toast. Nothing special, but it was the first time in years she had cooked for herself and anyone else. Eli sat at the waiting table, his eyes patient like someone used to giving others their space. As Clara put down the bowl of soup, Eli said, "Thank." The sentence was short, but it made Clara feel acknowledged in the gentlest way. Lifting his spoon, Eli tasted. He didn't praise. He didn't criticize. He just ate slowly, as if each bite was precious. Clara suddenly remembered at Laurel Creek. If the food wasn't to Jonas's liking, she'd get yelled at, or worse. And here, a bowl of soup can be just the thing to make someone feel good. After lunch, Eli gave Clara a thicker winter coat. "It will be cold this afternoon," he said. Clara put on the shirt, a little shocked to feel how warm it was. It was as if it had been well taken care of, even though she had just arrived. She said, "I have never had such a warm coat." Eli looked at her, his eyes without pity, only sincerity. The winters are long here. No one endures them alone. The seemingly normal statement. But it made Clara's eyes sting. In Laurel Creek, she had endured it all alone. Cold, hunger, fear, she had borne it all on her own. And here, someone told her that no one suffers alone. One sentence is enough to repair a small corner of the heart. In the afternoon, the sky turned gray. The wind changed direction. The valley smelled distinctly of snow. Eli led Clara to the old barn behind the house, a place he wanted to convert for storage. "This is where you can leave anything that belongs to you," he said. Clara looked around at the old wooden barn, its sloping roof and pockmarked walls. But it had space. Sunlight filtered through the cracks. There was a familiar smell of earth and wood. She hesitated. "Belong to me." Eli nodded. "Someday you'll want to keep something. Everyone needs a place like that." Clara bit her lip. She had never had a place of her own. No little corner to hide a keepsake, no box to keep anything memorable. Eli did not look at her. He just continued, "If you want to decorate, go ahead. This one is for you." Clara stood there for a long time, feeling each word he said like raindrops soaking into dry soil. A woman who had never had the right to own anything was now given a place all her own. She said softly, "You are too kind." Eli shook his head. There is no such thing as too much kindness. And that was the phrase Clara carried with her all day. That evening after work, Clara sat by her window. The wind picked up. The first snowflakes began to fall from the night sky. They fell as softly as the white ashes of a fading memory. Clara looked at her hands. Hands that had been shaking with fear. Now, they were still shaking, but with a strange sense of hope. In her heart there was a struggle. Can I trust this place? Trust Eli? Believe that life can be different? Or am I just a temporary traveler, only to be pulled back by the darkness? A light knock on the door startled her. Clara, Eli's voice rang out from outside. She opened the door. Eli stood there holding an oil lamp in his hand. "It's snowing heavily tonight. If you need extra light, use this." Clara took the lamp, only able to say 2 words. "Thank you, sir." Eli nodded, stepping back a little so she wouldn't feel pressured, then turned back down the stairs. Clara watched his back. A silent, calm man who brought security with the smallest gestures. And she understood that. The door to her soul, which had been tightly closed for many years, had just opened a very small crack. Just one slot. But that gap lets light in. The next morning, the sky over Sheridan Ridge was covered with the soft white of the night snow. The farm seemed enveloped in a deeper silence than usual. The trees in the yard were covered with a thin layer of snow, and the smoke from the Ward chimneys rose in a thin white line, standing upright in the mild cold. Clara woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. Not fear, but something like nostalgia. Missing something she never had. A family. A life she didn't have to run away from. A home with familiar footsteps. She got out of bed, put on her coat, and went downstairs. Eli wasn't in the kitchen today. The front door was ajar, and the wind blew in, carrying a light snow, leaving the floor cool under Clara's feet. She went out onto the porch and found Eli leaning against the railing, his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the white hills. He stood still and thoughtful. His breath came out in thin clouds. Clara walked up to him, standing at a comfortable distance like the past few days. "You get up too early." Eli didn't turn around right away. He just nodded. "The wind has changed direction. I want to see if the snow will get any heavier today." Clara followed his gaze. In the distance, dark clouds were slowly gathering as if something heavy hung in the air. Is something wrong? Clara asked. Eli kept looking toward the foot of the hill for a long time. It's not about the weather, he said, then exhaled slowly. It's just, sometimes the past doesn't stay as still as we'd like. Clara paused. That statement touched on something she had been trying to hide every day. I understand that feeling, she replied in a small voice. Eli inclined his head toward her, not asking further. His eyes lingered for a second, long enough for Clara to know that he understood not through words but through the wounds people saw in each other. They ate breakfast of hot cornbread and crispy bacon. The meal was quiet, not stuffy, not distant. Clara cut into pieces of bread on her plate, trying to keep her hands from shaking as she thought about what Eli had said. Eli put down the plate and looked at her for a moment. If you want, I can take you into town this afternoon. There are some things you need to buy. Clara was a little surprised. Do I need to go down there? Eli replied calmly. You just moved here. You should pick out a few things that are yours, to show that you really live here, not just temporarily. The words made Clara's heart soften like a cookie in a hot oven. Mine. She had never had anything that belonged to her. Okay, Clara replied softly. A simple sentence. But for the first time in years, she wanted to step out of her small comfort zone. The snow stopped falling in the afternoon. They took the wagon down Sheridan Ridge. The snow-covered road made the wheels sink slightly, and the sound of the horses trampling the snow was soft as breathing. The small town in the valley began to bustle. People swept snow from their eaves, a few children threw small balls of snow at each other, and laughter echoed in the cold air. Clara sat at the back, trying to shrink back. Every glance she received made her tense, though no one seemed hostile. She was not used to people looking at her with the normal curiosity of life. Eli realized that. He spoke softly, his voice low and slow. Nobody here knows anything about you. Nobody judges you. They just look because they've never met you. Clara breathed a sigh of relief. Where I used to live, other people's eyes were always a sign of trouble. Eli said simply, not here. A silence passed, and for the first time Clara did not want to step back. She wanted to believe it, that in this place people's eyes did not carry the sharpness of knives. They stopped at the small grocery store of Miss Martha Rowe, a woman with gray hair, slightly bent with age but bright-eyed and alert. Martha saw Eli first, smiling broadly. Ward, are you here to buy nails or horse feed? Eli shook his head, his voice low but soft. I didn't buy anything for the farm today. I brought my fiancé here to pick up some things. Clara almost dropped her gloves. Fiancé. Those 3 words rang like an internal bell, making her catch her breath. Not that she objected, but because it was so sudden, so real. Martha turned to look at Clara, but her eyes held no judgment or scrutiny, just the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to know who was hurting. Oh, it's you. Martha stepped closer, her voice warm as a thick wool blanket. Ward wrote to order the fabric a few months ago. I figured he'd need it soon. Clara blushed, so embarrassed she wanted to hide in her coat. Eli looked down at his boots and said nothing, but his ears turned slightly red. They really looked like a couple learning to navigate each other's lives. Clara picked out a few items, a pale blue scarf, a small notebook, a few personal items. Each one was carefully wrapped by Martha. As she looked at each item in her hands, Clara felt both excited and nervous, as if each one was a small step into a world she had thought was out of her reach. As they left the store, the afternoon wind turned colder. Eli put his coat on her in such a casual manner that Clara didn't know whether to feel embarrassed or touched. They had just passed the blacksmith shop when from inside came the loud sound of hammers falling. A large man stepped out with tangled hair and a thick beard and sharp, deep eyes. He looked at Eli first, then at Clara. The look made Clara freeze. Not dangerous, not violent, but recognition, as if he knew her from somewhere. Eli took a half-step forward, blocking her lightly. What's wrong, Hank? The man named Hank stopped looking at Clara, then said no. It's just, I think I've seen this girl somewhere before. Clara paled, clutching her coat. Her heart pounded like a warning drum. No, it couldn't be. No one from Laurel Creek could be here. Hank looked back once more, then shook his head. Must be the wrong person. Eli said in a low but firm voice, She's Clara Sutton, from the east. Hank shrugged. I don't interfere in anyone's private life. Have a good afternoon." He went into the shop, the wooden door closed with a heavy sound. But Clara stood there frozen. Eli tilted his head to look at her. "Are you okay?" Clara tried to smile, but she couldn't lift a facial muscle. "It's just, I thought he knew me." Eli looked at her for a long moment, his eyes so deep that Clara felt like he was looking right into her heart. "Clara," he said slowly, "no one here knows your past, and no one has the right to scare you." Clara's chest ached as if a mountain wind was blowing straight into it. She understood that Eli was not just talking about Hank. He was talking about the old shadows standing behind her, the ones she thought she'd buried on the train ride to Sheridan Ridge. But as it turned out, the darkness didn't go away. It just slept for a while. And Clara knew this was only the first time the past had brushed against her in the new land. A word of warning, a sigh of fate. On the way back to the farm, Clara was silent. Not because she was angry, but because her heart was as tangled as a cotton thread pulled too hard. She feared one thing: if the past found her, if Jonas or someone who knew her showed up, what will she bring to Eli? To this farm? To the peaceful life she has just touched? The evening wind blew cold as a knife blowing Clara's hair. Eli slowed his horse. He didn't ask. He didn't press her. But his silence this time was different. A silence like an invitation. If you want to talk, I will listen. If you want to keep a secret, I will wait too. Clara looked at him, and for the first time she tried to name the new feeling. Maybe. I trust this man. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to want to stay. When they got home, the sun had set. The sky was purple and the cold wind carried the scent of snow. Eli stopped the wagon and turned to her. "Tomorrow, if you want, I can teach you to ride a horse." Clara was surprised. "I have never ridden a horse." "I know," Eli said, "but I thought you would like the feeling of being able to go as far as you wanted." The words touched the thinnest of strings in Clara's heart. Freedom. She nodded, small and light. "Okay. I want to learn." Eli nodded slightly, his eyes warm like oil lamplight in the dark night. Then tomorrow. And that was the moment Clara knew her new life had truly begun. The next morning was much clearer. Thin clouds scattered across the pale blue sky, and the sun glinted off the frozen snow in streaks of glitter. The air was chilly, but there was a pleasant smell. The smell of a new day, carrying with it the promise of something. Clara put on her coat and scarf and walked out into the yard. Eli was waiting in the stables, his hand on Maple's saddle. When he heard Clara's footsteps in the snow, he looked up, his eyes warm but calm as usual. "Are you ready?" Eli asked. Clara swallowed. She had never ridden a horse, never thought she would do anything so brave. But something about yesterday's offer made her want to try to step out of the old shell life had forced her into. "I think I want to try." Her voice was small but strong enough for Eli to hear. Eli didn't smile, but his eyes softened slightly. "Okay." Maple stood still, her demeanor gentle enough to make a child feel safe. Her fur was warm, her breathing steady. Eli placed a hand on her back, explaining each step. "First, don't walk yet. Let Maple smell your hand. Let it know who you are." Clara held out her hand, trying to keep it from shaking. Maple sniffed lightly, its large, deep eyes looking at her as if assessing her goodwill. "See," Eli said. "It just wants to know if you're scared." Clara said softly, "I am scared." "I know," Eli replied, his voice soft but firm. "But being afraid doesn't mean you're wrong. It's just, you haven't had a chance to learn otherwise." Those words were like a light touch on Clara's old wound. It didn't hurt, but it made her want to hold her breath. Eli continued, "Let me help you up." He stepped up behind her, not too close, not forcing her against him, just enough distance to provide support. His hand brushed Clara's elbow as he spoke. "When I count to 3, put your feet on the stirrups and lean over the saddle. I'll keep you from falling." Clara nodded, her heart beating faster as she realized the trust she was about to place in a man, something she hadn't done in many years. "Dad," Eli said very softly, as if to not startle her. Clara did as she was told. As she lifted herself, her foot slipped, sending her reeling. But Eli's hand caught her sure, steady, just in time. No jerking, no pulling, just holding. She settled back in the saddle, breathing heavily. Eli looked down at her. "You did well." Clara felt her chest expand a little as if the air became more breathable. Now put both feet in the stirrups. Lean lightly on the horse's back. Let Maple feel that you're not a threat. Clara followed suit, her hands on the saddle but kept higher than necessary. Eli walked slowly towards her, never touching her unless absolutely necessary. He said, "It's okay. You don't have to act brave. Horses can sense it. Just breathe normally." Clara exhaled, this time longer and softer. She felt Maple shift her weight, its body warm and alive beneath her. Eli took the reins and led Maple around the yard. "Let your body move with it," he said. "Don't resist. Just let yourself flow." Clara tried to relax. At first she was stiff, but with each turn, each step, she felt herself no longer being the passive one. No one was shouting behind her back. No one was sticking a cigarette into the door to make her bow her head. No one was forcing her to run out of fear. There was only the sound of horses trampling through the snow, the wind blowing through the fields, and Eli's low, steady voice. "You see," he said after a long circle, "freedom does not come with a bang. It comes little by little." Clara pursed her lips to keep the tears from falling. "I don't think I can do it," she said softly. "You did it," Eli replied without a hint of smugness, just matter-of-factly. When Maple stopped, Clara remained in the saddle, reluctant to get off. The feeling of being high above the ground, in control of her own direction, made her chest feel as if it was on fire. Eli stood below, looking at her, his eyes squinting from the sunlight reflecting off the snow. "If you want, I can teach you to ride on your own. No need for a guide." Clara chuckled slightly. "Can I do it?" Eli shrugged one shoulder, half serious, half teasing. "If you ask me, I think you can do more than you think." The words were like a hammer hitting the ice inside her. She looked down at Eli, a strange feeling settling in her stomach, not simple gratitude, not admiration, but a desire to trust him a little more. "Okay," she said. "And tomorrow, I want to continue studying." Eli nodded. "Any day you want. I'm here." In the afternoon, after watering the horses, they gathered hay together. Clara felt her body lighter than yesterday, as if every movement was a weight off her body. She was shaking a little in the saddle. Eli said. "I know," Clara confessed. "But you keep going. That's what matters." That statement confused Clara. She wasn't used to people caring enough about her feelings to say something like that. "Do you always see people so clearly?" she asked, half shy, half genuinely curious. Eli answered honestly, "Only with the person I want to see." Clara was silent for a few seconds, and Eli was silent too. They returned home as the sky grew dark. A light snow was falling again. Dinner was stew and fresh bread. Clara ate slowly, feeling the warmth spread down her neck and into her heart. As Eli stood up to make tea, Clara said, "Today, I thank you." Eli didn't look at her right away. He poured hot water into the teapot, steam rising up to partially obscure his face. "No thanks," he said. "You learned to ride for yourself." Clara pursed her lips. "But you helped me believe I could do it." Eli turned to look at her. There was something deep, very deep in his eyes, like the bottom of a lake, thawing in the spring sun. He placed the cup of tea in front of her and said, "Actually, you just need someone who doesn't scare you." Clara bowed her head. Her heart broke in a strange way, breaking to soften. That night when Clara went upstairs, she stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow fall, watching the roof of the stable where she had first ridden Maple, watching the light in the living room below where Eli sat alone making tea and reading the newspaper. In her mind, questions swirled. Why is someone like him so kind to me? What does he want? What does he hide behind that silent gaze? And will I be able to trust him completely one day? She doesn't know. But tonight, for the first time in years, she wanted to know the answer. Wanted, not because of fear, but because her heart had opened a little, just a little, to something new. She placed her hand on her chest. Beneath the warm wool, her heart no longer trembled, but beat rhythmically, the rhythm of one learning to live again. The next morning, the early winter sun poured down on Sheridan Ridge like a pale golden honey. The air was cold enough to numb her hands, but the sun brightened everything. Clara opened the door to her room and smelled coffee, wood smoke, and a peace she had only dreamed of for years. Eli was in the kitchen, his back to her. He stood over the bacon, turning each piece with his usual patience. When he turned back, his gaze lingered on Clara's face longer than usual. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Clara was a little surprised by the simple question that softened her heart. "I slept more deeply than I thought," she replied. "It must have been the longest sleep I've had in a long time." Eli just nodded, but there was something in his look that looked like relief. Real relief. "Eat something. We're going to be busy today." Clara sat at the old wooden dining table. Eli placed a plate of bacon, fried eggs, and freshly baked cornbread in front of her. It was simple, but to Clara, it felt like a family meal, something she had never truly had. During the meal, there was a knock on the door, soft, polite. Unlike any knock she had heard in all the years she had lived with Jonas Keene, it was always a menacing knock, an unspoken warning. Eli put down his fork. "I'll open it." The door opened, and Clara heard a middle-aged woman's voice. "Hello, Mr. Ward. I brought some apple pie. I was so glad to hear Maple was well yesterday." Eli opened the door wider. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." "Come in, Mrs." Miller entered with a warm, kind smile. When her eyes fell on Clara, they were not curious, not judgmental, but the warmth of a mother who had watched many young women struggle to rise from the ruins. "Are you Clara? I've heard good things about you." Clara blushed. "I'm just trying." "Trying is enough, Mrs. Miller replied, her voice firm like someone who has experienced loss, but still chooses to live with kindness. She sat down at the table and placed the box of apple pie in front of Clara. "Well, our Eli has always been quiet. Who would have thought he would accept another person into the family?" Clara was a little embarrassed, but Mrs. Miller smiled and waved her hand. "Don't get me wrong. Everyone here loves him. But Mr. Eli has always kept his distance. Since his family died, he's been eerily quiet." Clara turned to look at Eli. He was leaning against the sink, unresponsive, just silent. But she sensed the darkness in his eyes. The same darkness that was in her heart, though of different origin. Mrs. Miller continued, "I'm glad his house now has the sound of talking footsteps and someone to make another pot of tea." Eli said softly, "She has brightened my house." Clara bowed her head as that statement made her heart clench in a way that was both painful and beautiful. After Mrs. Miller left, Eli placed 2 cups of tea on the table. "Do you mind if we clean the back room today?" "Which room?" "My wife's old room." Clara paused. Not out of jealousy, but because she understood the sacredness of such a space. "If you're not sure, I'm sure." His voice was low, but it was as sure as a declaration after years of waiting. "That room has been closed for too long. And this house, there are more people now. You don't need to sleep in that small room forever. I want you to have better space. But that room must hold many memories for you." Eli was silent for a few seconds. "Yes." Then he added slowly and deeply, "But memory doesn't mean keeping yourself locked up. I think it's time to let the light in." Clara looked at him, and in that moment she understood this silent man was healing in his own way too. She nodded. "Then, I will help." The old room was at the end of the hallway. When the door opened, the smell of old wood mixed with a light herbal scent wafted out. As if time had never passed in this room. The curtains were pale blue, covered with a layer of dust from time. The large wooden bed was old but sturdy. A half-finished woolen scarf someone had knitted lay on the table. Eli stood in the doorway for a long time, as if he were looking into a space that only he could see. Clara said nothing. She gave him space. Finally, Eli stepped in, picking up the unfinished scarf. "She liked to knit scarves in the winter," he said softly, "and always had something unfinished." Clara replied in a voice as soft as a breath, "Maybe." She never thought she needed to complete it, because at that time, she still had a future. Eli looked at Clara, his eyes showing for the first time that day a sadness that had been polished by years. Maybe. They cleaned up together. Clara dusted the curtains, rearranged the bedding, and opened the window to let in a cool breeze carrying the scent of pine trees from the distant meadows. The space gradually becomes brighter. Eli removed the old hangers one by one, placing the mementos in a wooden box. But his movements were not shaky, not avoiding, not cringing. It was a calm confrontation, something Clara hoped she could do with her own past one day. When they finished, Eli stood in the middle of the room. What had once been filled with sad memories was now a quiet, clean space, and a new page had been opened. "Thank you," he said, looking at Clara. "It's nothing," she replied. "You've helped me a lot." Eli shook his head. "Today, you helped me more than you think." In the afternoon, the snow stopped falling. The wind blew, creating soft curves on the ground. Clara stepped out onto the porch, feeling her heart as light as the air itself. Eli stood leaning against the porch pillar, holding a wooden box containing mementos from his old room. "Where are you going to put that box?" Clara asked. "In storage," he replied. "We don't need to forget the past, just not live in it." Clara smiled. "Yes." At that moment, the two stood side by side in silence, but the silence no longer had distance. It became harmony, like two people, each with a wound, standing on the brink of a new beginning. The wind blew a few strands of Clara's hair into her face. Eli raised his hand as if to help her brush it aside, but stopped mid-air. He lowered his hand as if respecting a fragile boundary that Clara wasn't quite ready to cross. But Clara saw, and she wasn't afraid. That night, as Clara lay in bed in her new room, she looked up at the wooden ceiling, listened to the wind outside, and thought of Eli's hand stopping just inches away. Don't touch her, but don't back away either. She wondered what that feeling was, trust or something else, slowly forming. Her heart answered with a small beat. No panic, no alertness, but rather expect. She placed her hand on her chest. "Freedom," she whispered. "Maybe freedom sometimes begins with allowing someone to stand right next to you, without making you afraid anymore." Mornings at Sheridan Ridge always had a special stillness, but that morning Clara sensed something different in the air. The sky was so clear she could see the outlines of distant mountains. The wind was light as a breath, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. From the kitchen she heard the distant clop of horseshoes, the familiar sound of Eli returning from the stables. Clara was making tea when the door opened. Eli walked in his thick coat covered in a thin layer of snow. "The morning is colder than I expected," he said, his voice low but gentle, like a low melody wafting through the air. Clara poured him tea. "You're up so early, the sheep need to check the fence. The wind was strong last night, and I'm afraid a section of it will collapse due to falling snow." She watched his hands cupping the hot tea, the hands of a man who had worked all his life strong and secure. Clara had always noticed that Eli never drank his tea before setting the cup down for her. It was as if he wanted her to feel cared for before he thought of himself. She smiled, a soft smile that warmed the kitchen. "Are you okay sleeping in your new room?" Eli asked, as if that question were more important than the sheep fence. "Better than I expected," Clara replied. "It feels like I can breathe more deeply." Eli said nothing more, but Clara saw his shoulders relax, a rare sign of contentment. After breakfast, Eli said he had to go into town. "Go buy some nails and some seeds. Also stop by the post office," he said. Clara raised her head slightly. "Are you sending a letter?" "Yes. Some papers to deliver," he answered curtly without explanation. Clara didn't press the question. Eli was like that. Quiet but not secretive in a way that made people uneasy. He was like a mountain, quiet but always there, clear and trustworthy. Still, Clara felt a little curious. He always said papers to be delivered, but never said what kind of papers. And every time he visited the post office, he went alone. Clara spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, washing towels, and then going out to the porch to sweep the snow. The sunlight made the snow sparkle like thousands of glass beads scattered on the ground. As she swept, her eyes accidentally fell on the corner of the yard, where a wooden box containing Eli's wife's mementos was temporarily placed under the small porch. She felt something gently pull at her heart, not jealousy but pity. Pity for a man who had lost almost everything but still knew how to open his heart again. Pity for the loneliness he hid behind his composure. Clara bent down to brush the snow off the lid of the wooden box, her hand touching the cold wood grain. How long has he been going through this pain, she wondered. Then she stood up straight, took a deep breath, and looked toward the road leading out of town. Maybe I should learn to let the past stay in its place, she thought. Eli hadn't returned home by noon. Usually his shopping trips only took a few hours. Clara began to worry. Not in an irrational, fearful way, but instinctively, like someone who had lost so much. She put on her coat and went out into the yard to look at the fields. The cold air on her face woke her up. And then she saw it. Not Eli, but it was an envelope left on the doorstep. No one in Wyoming would leave a letter on a doorstep instead of delivering it to someone. It simply means the person delivering it doesn't want to be seen. Clara picked up the envelope. Her face paled slightly. From Jameson County Marshal Office. Her heart was pounding. She started to take the envelope into the house but stopped. No, this was from Eli. This was his business. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter, staring at it as if it might explode at any moment. About an hour later, the familiar sound of hooves rang out. Eli returned his coat, covered in road dust, carrying several bags of goods. Clara opened the door before he could knock. "You have mail." She pointed to the envelope. Eli's eyes changed slightly, not much, but enough to show she knew what the letter said, or at least he was expecting it. Without a word, Eli put down his things, pulled up a chair, and opened the envelope. Clara stood at a distance, not wanting to intrude but unable to help but feel anxious. Eli read each line. No expression. Then he put the letter down on the table, letting out a long breath. A breath she had never heard from him. Clara approached her voice, low and reserved. "If you need me out, I can." "No," he interrupted softly but firmly. "You stay here." Clara sat down across from Eli. He was silent for a long time. The wind from the porch blew in through the crack in the door, causing the wall hanging to sway slightly. Finally, Eli spoke up. "Clara, I've been sending letters to the neighboring districts for over a year now." Her eyes widened. "Why? Why?" Still not looking at her, Eli said slowly. "Because I suspected Jonas Keene would come looking for you, and because he wasn't just some ordinary brute. He was involved in a forced labor ring. I saw that in the records of the men who left your town." Clara was silent. Her chest felt like someone had pushed it. "When did you know? Since the second week you were here." He looked her straight in the eyes. "I didn't ask because I didn't want to scare you anymore. But I know that kind of fear. And I know there's something worth investigating." "Jonas." Clara's voice trembled. "He is really being hunted," Eli nodded. "This letter says he has left the old coal camp, and he has been seen near the western border." Clara felt her stomach churn. "You think he will come here?" "Don't think," Eli replied. "I know." She stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. Old images suddenly flooded back. Heavy footsteps, a large shadow blocking the door, a loud shout, a slap that was too sudden to dodge. Eli stood up, walked around the table, and stopped in front of Clara. "I am prepared," he said, his voice low but steady like a wooden wall against a storm. Clara shook her head. "I don't want you to be in danger because of me." Eli placed a hand on the back of the chair next to her, keeping her distance but surrounding her with solidity. "The danger doesn't come from you," he said. "The danger comes from what he did. What I did was stop him." Clara looked at him a long time. Eli's eyes held no anger, no impatience, no hatred. Only the determination of a man who had known loss, who had known fear, and who had chosen to stand on the side of justice. "Why did you do all that?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. Eli looked out the window where the white fields stretched on forever. "Because my silence does not mean I do not see," he replied. "It does not mean I do not care." Then he turned back to look at Clara, his eyes straight, sincere, naked, undisguised. "And because you deserve a life that no one can take away from you." Clara felt her eyes burn, not with fear but with another, deeper, warmer emotion. She said nothing, just lightly held the edge of her shirt to keep her hands from shaking. Eli stood up straight, took his thick coat, and said, "I'll check the north fence tonight. You stay inside. I'll be back before dark." Clara nodded, but as Eli walked out the door, she called after him. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "for not abandoning me." Eli nodded slightly, very slowly, and walked out. The door closed, leaving the kitchen in the twilight. Clara stood staring at the envelope on the table for a long time. The words "Marshal Office" seemed to be staring right at her. No doubt, the past is coming near, but this time she was not alone. The afternoon passed slowly like a winter river. The north wind blew through the pines, stirring the snow in thin white petals. Clara stood by the window and looked out at the fields fading into darkness. The distance from the porch to the north fence was only a few hundred yards, but to her at that moment it seemed like an eternity. Eli has been gone for more than 2 hours. He had said he would be back before dark. But the last light of day had already sunk behind the mountains, leaving a somber blue blanket over Sheridan Ridge. Clara took the oil lamp and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit at her cheeks. She pulled her shawl tight and looked north where Eli had come to check the fence. No lantern light. No sound of hooves. No tall, silent figure returning. A ripple of anxiety ran down her spine like an off note in a familiar piece of music. "Don't think nonsense, Clara," she reminded herself, but her voice was weak and trembling like a thin thread. She went back inside and lit the fireplace. The flames flickered the orange light, seeming to embrace everything, chasing away the cold. She made a pot of herbal tea for the two of them, as was her custom. But every time she looked at the chair across from the wooden table, she felt a growing emptiness. Clara placed Eli's cup of tea on the table, steam rising, then quickly dissipating in the cold air. She sat down, her hands clasped together. Night began to seep into the house through the cracks in the door, through the void left by Eli. She remembered the letter on the kitchen table, and Eli's last words before he left, "I'm prepared." Prepare. The word rang in her head like a broken bell. Prepare for what? Was he? Jonas? So close. She shivered. When the wall clock struck 8, Clara jumped to her feet. She couldn't sit still another minute. Can't sit around like a man who no longer has the right to defend himself. "No, I'm not the same anymore," she said to herself. Clara put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, lit the lantern, and walked out into the yard. Each step on the snow made a steady creaking sound, but her heart was in turmoil. The wind blew harder. The lanterns flickered and swayed like candles before a storm. She didn't go far. Just as far as the north fence, where the red earth began to slope down into a small valley. But when the light reached just a few meters ahead, Clara stopped. On the white snow between the darkness and the cold light are traces, horse hoof prints, and human footprints. But not one person. Two. Clara felt her heart clench. "This is not the mark from before," she whispered. Beside the hoof print of the horse Eli had ridden, she recognized it because the front hoof was slightly chipped. There was another larger, deeper hoof print, indicating a heavier rider and stronger boots. She bent down and gently touched the footprint nearby. The foot was larger than Eli's. Longer. And the gait leaned slightly to the left, like someone with an injured right leg. A breath caught in Clara's throat. "Jonas." The name slipped from her lips in a whisper that reeked of old fear. She stood in the snow, the wind blowing her hair back from her coat, the lantern shaking so hard it threatened to fall from her hand. Everything around her became unusually quiet. So quiet she could hear her own heart beating roughly. She took a step back. Must go home. Must lock the door. Must. A sudden sound came from behind her. It wasn't loud, just the sound of snow being compressed, but it was enough to make Clara freeze in place. She turned her head slowly. It was just the wind. The wind broke a branch and it fell into the snow. Clara gasped, trying to steady her heartbeat. Calm down, calm down. But she knew in her mind something had really changed. Not just traces. But it's true, Jonas Keene was in Wyoming. And he was near Sheridan Ridge Ranch. Clara returned home even faster than she had left. She locked the front door with a barred lock, something Eli always did when he was away. Then she turned off the lights, leaving only the fireplace on so the house wouldn't stand out too much in the darkness. Every sound of the wind blowing through the roof made her jump. Every sound of the tree branch hitting the wall made her heart clench. She tried to make a new pot of tea, but her hands shook so much that she dropped a cup. The porcelain shattered with a sharp sound that made her close her eyes tightly. "Focus, Clara," she whispered. "Don't let your old fears guide you anymore." She gathered the pieces together and placed them in a towel. But she couldn't stop thinking about Eli. He had gone further than usual, and there was no reason he wouldn't be back. Unless she sat down in the chair, biting her lip to keep from crying out. "Don't panic. His name is Elias Ward. He's lived his whole life in the West. He knows how to protect himself. He knows how to handle danger. He knows." Another noise was heard outside. This time, it wasn't wind. It was like footsteps. Slow, heavy, dragging on the snow. Clara stood up abruptly, her heart pounding so hard it made it hard for her to breathe. "Eli," she called, her voice small and trembling. No reply. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. Right in front of the house. Clara put her hand to her mouth. Her body felt frozen. 1 second. 2 seconds. Already. Knock. 3. Slow. Duration, clear as the heavy heartbeat of memory. Clara instinctively stepped back lightly, bumping into the table. Those 3 knocks. That rhythm. That way of knocking. Unmistakable. That's the beat of Jonas Keene. She was almost out of breath. Stand still. The knocking repeated. 3 more. Then a voice, not loud but covering the space with a poisonous mist. Clara, I know you're in there. She clenched the corner of the table so hard it hurt. You can't run far, huh? His voice was like a snake slithering through the door. I'm here to take you home. Clara wanted to speak, but her throat was dry as sand. Her legs were shaking, but not because she was afraid. It was because she was using all her strength to keep her balance, to keep from falling. Jonas knocked 3 more times. Harder. I'm going to count to 3, Clara. If you don't open the door. His voice lowered. I'll come in myself. Clara didn't know if she was sobbing or gasping. Her breath came out in a mist. In that moment, all she wanted was to see Eli's familiar figure emerge from the darkness. Right now. Immediately. But outside. It was just snowing. She placed her hand on the lock, not to open it, but to feel that at least there was still a door between her and the devil. After several interminable seconds, Jonas's voice rang out again, this time lower but colder. Okay. If that's your choice. His footsteps retreated. There was a metallic click, the sound of a gun being cocked. Clara opened her mouth but was unable to speak. At that moment, another sound rang out from afar. The sound of horse hooves. Fast. Hurry. Strong. Clara recognized the voice at once. She rushed to the window and looked through the snow. A lantern was coming, mounted on a familiar horse. The rider was Eli. His cloak billowing in the wind, his hands clutching the reins, his eyes fixed on home, as if he knew exactly what was happening. Clara placed her hand on her chest, feeling as if life had just rushed back into her. But Jonas heard the horse too. He turned, his shadow stretching across the snow like a distorted, menacing shadow. She saw him tighten his grip on the gun, his shoulders jerking. If he comes any closer, Jonas growled, you'll see something bad. Clara couldn't call anymore. Eli rushed in like a strong wind, but Jonas was already standing right in front of the door. The distance between the 2 men was only a few steps, and Clara, standing inside the wooden door, felt like the whole world had stopped. The air is thick. Darkness gathers. She knows. That moment is the boundary between the old day and the new day of my life. The wind whistled through the eaves and the snow blew in swirling white swirls. Clara stood frozen behind the wooden door, her hands clutching the lock until they were numb. Outside, Eli was galloping toward her horse, the lantern before her saddle like a persistent star piercing the darkness. Jonas Keene turned, facing the light. He moved his finger closer to the trigger. Clara saw through the narrow crack of the door, the harsh lines of his face, etched in the moonlight. The man was just as she remembered him, a hulking shadow, his breath reeking of cheap tobacco, the cruelty never fading from his eyes. Clara's heart pounded against her chest. Each beat felt like it was tearing her fragile body apart. Eli dismounted before the animal came to a stop. His movements were quick, decisive, but unhurried. He unhooked the lantern from the saddle and let it hang on a hook on the porch post, the light falling on his face, a face frosted with snow but calm as a winter lake. Jonas Keene. Eli's voice came low and deep, but strong enough to cut through the wind. You have no business here. Jonas laughed, a dry, rusty laugh. You talk as if this land belonged to you. Eli didn't answer. He took a step up the steps, his body blocking half the door. Clara stood just inside the door, feeling the safety that just standing behind Eli brought. Jonas nodded toward the door. I just want back what's mine. My girl. Eli tilted his head slightly, his eyes unchanged, but his voice colder by half a degree. She doesn't belong to you. Jonas's smile was thin as a knife. That's what men say when they want to keep something that isn't theirs. Eli shifted his body as if to intentionally shield Clara more. The wordless action made Clara feel something hot running through her chest, not fear but excitement. Eli spoke very slowly, each word sinking into the ground. Here, everyone has the right to choose where they are safe. And she didn't choose you. Jonas snorted. She chose because she was afraid. Women follow men who can flatter their pity. Eli did not answer immediately. He just looked at Jonas with such cold eyes that Clara felt the air between the 2 men crack. Then Eli said, "You know nothing about real fear, Keen. And you understand even less about choice." A heavy silence stretched. The wind whistled through the pines, carrying a chill that felt bone-chilling. Jonas took a step forward, his gaze sliding from Eli to the doorway where Clara stood just behind. "Clara." His voice softened eerily. "Come here." Clara almost instinctively recoiled. Her whole body cringed. Her hands gripped the edge of the door until her fingertips turned white. Eli turned his head just a tiny bit. "Don't come out." He spoke softly enough for only she to hear. Jonas took another step. "If you don't come out, it will be worse for both of you," he said. "You know me, Clara. I don't give up easily." Clara felt her chest tighten. Old, threatening whispers rose like ghosts. "If you defy me, you will lose more than you know." Jonas had said so when she was a girl too young to protect herself, when she believed she would never escape. Clara put her hand to her chest, trying to calm herself. She looked at Eli from behind the door. Eli stood tall, his silhouette against the snow like a solid stone pillar. He did not tremble. He did not retreat. He did not get angry. He was just steadfast, a steadfastness that made Clara's heart feel anchored. "Clara is no longer your target for threats," Eli said. Jonas sneered. "I see. She's still afraid of me. Just as scared as the time I taught her not to be stubborn. Looks like the lesson worked." Clara gripped the edge of the door until it hurt. Eli was silent for a second. Not because he was afraid, but because he seemed to be fighting an urge deep in his chest, an emotion stronger than he wanted to admit. Then he said, "I don't know what you did to her before, but I know one thing: she survived. And now, she's not alone anymore." Jonas raised his eyebrows mockingly. "You think you can protect her? A man like you, living alone for so many years on this ruined farm?" Eli did not reply with words. He simply looked at Jonas as he would a stray wind, not dangerous because it was strong, but dangerous because it was meaningless. After a few seconds, Eli said, "I didn't protect her because I thought I was stronger. I did it because it was right." And because he paused, his voice low, as deep as the river's rocky shore. "I respected her." Jonas laughed. "Respect, she only understands power." Clara felt as if cold water had been poured over her. Her throat tightened. All the pain of the past year surged up, but this time mixed with a simmering anger, an anger she had never dared to feel. Eli lowered his voice. "You don't understand her. You only understand yourself." The air was thick. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Then Jonas raised the gun and pointed it straight at Eli's chest. Clara held her breath. Eli stood there unmoving. His posture was as straight as an old pine in a snowstorm. Last time, Jonas growled, "Give her to me." Eli replied unshaken, "No." The word "no" was as light as a breath, but as strong as a hammer. Clara felt her head pounding. All her senses were focused on the figure in front of the door. Jonas gritted his teeth. "Do you want to die?" Eli took a step down. Not quickly, not defiantly. Just the step of a man who knew what he believed. "I don't want to fight," he said. "But if you try to hurt anyone in this house, you won't get past the east fence." Jonas narrowed his eyes. "You think I'm scared?" Eli did not smile. He did not look stern. He was silent. A silence so deep that it seemed as if the ground beneath Jonas's feet had frozen. Clara looked and understood. This was the silence that Westerners lived with all their lives. The silence that didn't need much to be threatening. The silence that the person facing it would feel with all their soul that the man in front of them wouldn't back down. Jonas took a half step back, then turned the gun to point at the door, where Clara stood. Eli reacted immediately, rushing up like the wind. "Are not!" Clara screamed at the same time. Jonas pulled the trigger. Gunfire rang out. The strong wind made the lantern sway. The whole world seemed to fall into a blank space. Clara rushed out the door despite all the fear, all the memories, all the pain. Or snow whipped up at her feet. In the flickering yellow light and thick darkness she saw Eli stood blocking the door, his shoulders tilted slightly to the left. His hand came up, blocking the spot between Clara and the bullet. The gun in Jonas's hand was still smoking. His face changed from triumph to panic. Clara rushed to Eli's side, her hands shaking so much she couldn't touch him. Eli remained standing, but his breathing was heavy, very heavy. Clara gasped. "Are you okay?" Eli looked at her, his eyes as calm as the starless night. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was hoarse. Clara looked down. A small streak of blood was running down his jacket. Not much, but deep red standing out against the white snow. She almost fell to her knees. Jonas stepped back, his expression losing its composure for the first time. Eli stood in front of Clara despite his injury and the wind making him stagger slightly. He lifted his chin and looked straight at Jonas. "You should leave here before you do something you can't turn back from." Clara looked at Eli. And for the first time in her life she knew one thing clearly. This man does not stand for honor, not for duty, not to prove anything. He stood for her, for his own choice. And because the feeling is deeper than any words, the wind was blowing hard. The snow was flying blindingly. And in the midst of that chaos, Clara felt her past, the monster that had haunted her entire youth, shake for the first time. Not for her, but for Eli Ward, the quiet man who turned silence into the strongest shield she had ever known. The wind whistled through the eaves in a long howling sound like the lament of the wilderness. Snow flew in blinding swirls. Clara could barely feel anything but the pounding of her heart so loud it hurt. Eli stood in the middle of the yard, his shadow stretched out on the blood-stained snow. Jonas Keene took a few steps back, his face twisted in anger and surprise. He hadn't expected the man to stand before his gun, and even less that the bullet he fired at Eli wouldn't kill him. Clara rushed forward, her hands shaking, whether from cold or fear, it was unclear. "Eli, let me see the wound." Her voice broke. Eli raised a hand to block it. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to stand up straight despite leaning slightly to the left. Jonas watched the scene, his eyes narrowing with malice. "No problem," he sneered. "Let's see how long you can stand." Eli still stood between Clara and Jonas. Snow clung to his hair, his coat, and fell on his bleeding shoulders. Anyone who didn't know better might have thought he was standing in a mere snowstorm, not at the gunpoint of a predator accustomed to violence. "You have no reason to stay here any longer," Eli said, his voice strangely calm. Jonas glanced at the house behind Eli where Clara stood, pressed against the door, her eyes wide, frightened but also determined. The look made him tighten his grip on his gun. "She's mine," Jonas growled. "I'm not going anywhere until I take her with me." Clara clutched the edge of her shirt, biting her lip. Jonas's words stabbed at old wounds. But this time, in the midst of her fear, there was a new flame, small but warm and steady. It was lit by the man standing in front of her in the wind. Eli took a deep breath, his eyes darkened. "You will not touch her again, Keene." Jonas sneered. "You're weak. I can see you're bleeding." Eli did not reply. He just placed his hand on the back door, as if to signal Clara. "Go inside. Lock the door." But before she could step back, Jonas raised his gun, pointing it straight at Eli's head. "Don't move," Clara shouted. "Jonas, don't." Eli turned slightly, blocking her from Jonas's view. The action made Jonas's anger flare up like coals in the wind. "I told you. If you stand up for him, I'll put you both on the ground." In that moment, the snow seemed to stop in midair. The air was so thick that Clara found it hard to breathe. Her hand instinctively reached out as if to pull Eli back to keep him away from the gun pointed straight at his chest. But Eli didn't back down, didn't jump aside, didn't hide. He just stood there, his posture straight as rotten wood in winter, but steadfast as a mountain rock that had stood through generations. "Keene," he said, "you won't win." Jonas pulled the trigger, but suddenly from afar came a metallic screech, the sound of a gun being loaded, not Jonas's, but of another person. A familiar voice, strong and clear, came from the end of the fence, where the red light of the neighbor's house was faintly reflected through the snow. "That's enough, Jonas. Put the gun down." Jonas turned around. Mrs. Miller stood beside her horse, holding a long shotgun whose power most men in this part of the world knew. She did not tremble. She did not hide. She was not afraid. She just stood in the snow, her figure small but strong like an old pine tree. Clara gasped, almost collapsing with relief. Jonas growled, "Crazy old woman. Get out of the way. My hand is stronger than you think," Mrs. Miller replied. "And I know who you are, Keene. The marshal's office has been asking about you for a month. You know you can't run." Jonas looked at Mrs. Miller, then at Eli, then at Clara. His eyes were red with anger and with a feeling of being cornered. He raised his gun again, but this time the target wasn't Eli. "But it is Clara." Clara saw the barrel of the gun pointed at her. She stood frozen. Time seemed to stretch so far that she could hear the beat of her heart against her bones. And before her brain could comprehend what was happening, Eli rushed over and used his entire body to push her into the house. A gunshot rang out. A flash of light. The wind rose to a scream. Clara fell to the wooden floor, her breath hitching. The door slammed behind them. Outside, the snow was stirred by someone's violent movements. Eli, Clara cried, groping for him in the chaotic darkness. Eli lay down beside her, leaning over, breathing heavily. Clara touched his shoulder. Her hand was wet. Not snow. Blood. You're hurt, she choked her hands, shaking uncontrollably. Eli took her wrist, his voice low and hoarse. It's okay. But Clara could hear his breathing hitching, his chest heaving. That strong man, the one who had stood in the snowy night to protect her, was beginning to collapse. Outside, Mrs. Miller shouted Jonas Keene, "If you don't put the gun down, I'll blow your hand off." A commotion arose, footsteps, whined the sound of people staggering on the snow. Clara wanted to look outside, but Eli gently tugged on her hand. "Don't. Open the door. Don't." He breathed heavily, pushing himself up with his hands on the floor. "You don't need to," Clara choked. "You need to lie down." "Let me, I'm fine," Eli repeated, but this time his voice was weaker. Clara placed her hand on his cheek, trying to keep her voice from breaking into tears. "Eli, don't say that. You're bleeding too much." Eli looked at her, his eyes weak but still holding their familiar calm. In them, Clara saw not pain, but worry. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She choked. "No, I'm fine. It was you. You were shot because of me." Eli closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, his voice thin but firm. "Clara, you are what matters." Her heart felt like it was breaking. This man. His silence wasn't cold. It was devotion. It was an unspoken promise. Outside, screams rang out. "Put down your gun, Jonas, stop." Clara looked out the window. Mrs. Miller's lantern light was flickering. A large shadow was running toward the woods. It was Jonas. "No," Clara whispered. He ran away. Eli tried to stand, but his body swayed slightly. Clara caught him, his shoulder heavy on hers. "Don't chase," Eli tried to say. "I don't let anyone out like this," Clara replied, her voice no longer trembling. It was as if for a brief moment she had crossed a line within herself. She helped Eli sit on the bench, her hands shaking, as she removed his jacket to reveal the wound. The bullet had grazed his left shoulder, tearing a long gash but not penetrating deeply. Still, the blood was flowing profusely from the cold. She took a deep breath, remembering what her mother had taught her about bandaging wounds. Clara put her hand on Eli's shoulder. "I'll stop the bleeding for you right away." Eli leaned his head back against the chair, breathing heavily, but his eyes followed her every move, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to make sure she was safe. Clara worked as quickly as she could, tears falling onto her hands as she wrapped the bandage around his shoulder. She whispered, "You shouldn't have rushed out like that. You shouldn't have risked your life for me. You shouldn't have." Eli placed his hand on the back of her hand, squeezing it gently. "Not because of recklessness. Because of you." Her heart felt like someone was squeezing it. Outside, Mrs. Miller's horse's hooves echoed Clara. "Is Eli okay?" Clara shouted back, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm taking care of him." Jonas ran into the woods. "Lock the door," Mrs. Miller replied in the wind. "I'll call the marshal's office." Clara turned back to see Eli breathing heavily, but his eyes were warmer and more enduring than any man she had ever known. She put her hand on his cheek. "Elia, you must not faint. You must stay here with me." Eli opened his eyes and smiled weakly but genuinely. "I'm here. One promise, one breath, one life." In the middle of that snowy night, Clara knew that her heart had finally found peace. The night stretched on like a lifetime. The wind howled louder, carrying a chilling sound through the wood of the house. Clara sat next to Eli, her hands on his shoulders, keeping steady pressure to staunch the bleeding. The fireplace burned behind them, its light reflecting off both their faces, one battling a dull ache, the other battling the fear of losing the most precious thing in his life. Each of Eli's breaths seemed to drag on for a long time. Clara heard it all, his hoarse breathing, the heavy beat of his heart, the soft groan as she tightened the bandages. Each sound stabbed her heart. "You have to lie down and rest." Clara's voice was small but firm. Eli shook his head, trying to keep his back straight. No, I can sit. Clara sighed heavily, half worried, half annoyed by the man's stubbornness. Eli, you need to let your body recover. If you keep trying, I'm fine, he repeated, but Clara heard the fatigue in his voice. She placed her hand on his cheek, forcing him to look at her. Please, let me help. Don't be strong alone. Eli was silent for a few seconds, and for the first time that night his stubborn shoulders relaxed a little, as if he admitted he was tired, and more importantly, he trusted her to see it. Clara helped him lie down on the sofa near the fireplace. He did not resist. When his head hit the pillow, Eli winced slightly in pain. Clara quickly adjusted the bandage on his shoulder, her movements so careful that Eli let out a small sigh. You did well, he said, his eyes never leaving her. Clara bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. I just don't want you to get hurt anymore. Her voice caught. Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised his hand very slowly, very gently, so as not to frighten her. He placed his finger on the back of her hand. A light touch. A wordless, thank you. Outside, the sound of hooves faded away. Every now and then, Clara heard Mrs. Miller calling out as she circled the farmhouse to make sure Jonas had really gone. But inside the house, only the two of them were breathing. Clara covered Eli with another blanket. You stay here. I'll boil some hot water. Eli smiled tiredly. You don't need. I need it, Clara replied, standing up. But when she turned her back, Eli said softly, Clara. She stopped and turned to look at him. Eli tried to lift himself up a little, but Clara ran to hold him back. Don't try to sit up. It hurts. Eli looked at her for a long time. His eyes, though tired, had something deep, something Clara had never seen him give anyone else. I'm sorry, he said. Clara froze. Sorry? For what? To scare you, Eli replied. Clara's chest tightened. No, it's not your fault. You saved me. You stood between me and him. Eli shook his head slightly. I wouldn't have come back sooner. If I had come earlier, he wouldn't have come so close to the door. Clara sat down beside him, placing her hand on her chest to keep her heart from racing further. Eli, you can't be responsible for everything. I've been afraid of him all my life. But tonight, for the first time, I didn't run away. Eli opened her eyes a little wider. You did well. No. Clara shook her head. It was because you stood by me. They sat in silence for a while. But it wasn't a heavy silence. It was like two souls catching their breath after a storm. Clara got up to boil some water, occasionally glancing back at Eli to make sure he wasn't overexerting himself. In the firelight, his face showed exhaustion but still strength. The fire cast his shadow against the wall like a man who had endured many winters, overcome many losses, and still stood. Clara mixed a bowl of herbal medicine. She'd learned it from the elders in the neighborhood where she'd grown up. When she returned, she found Eli dozing. His legs were stretched out near the fireplace, his hand on his stomach, his breathing more even than before. Clara put the bowl of herbs on the table and sat down on the floor beside the chair. The firelight illuminated her face, revealing fatigue, lingering fear, and something slowly changing inside her. She looked at Eli, feeling a wave of emotion rise up. He shielded me from the bullet, she whispered. He didn't hesitate. A tear fell onto her hand. Not a tear of fear like the old ones, but a tear of gratitude and something else. Gentler, warmer, and more dangerous to her once broken heart. Clara leaned close to Eli to hear his breathing, a steady, heavy but steady breath like the man himself. She spoke very softly, as if afraid to awaken the pain in his shoulder. Eli, you don't have to protect me like that. But then she put her hand on his shoulder where the bandage was soaked with blood and whispered again, but I know. I wasn't scared when you were there. The fire in the fireplace flickered as if listening to her words. Near midnight, Mrs. Miller returned. Her knock was very soft, as if afraid to disturb the injured person. Clara opened the door. Mrs. Miller was covered in snow, her coat damp with cold. Are you okay, Clara? She asked, her voice old but strong. Clara nodded. Eli was hurt. But okay. Jonas, he ran into the woods. Mrs. Miller frowned. I've already told the marshals. They'll be here tomorrow morning. Clara breathed a sigh of relief, but her heart was still filled with unease. Mrs. Miller looked over at Eli. Is he okay? Clara pursed her lips. Fine. Just weak. Mrs. Miller put her hand on Clara's shoulder and squeezed gently. "Don't let yourself tremble. There's Eli, there's me, and soon there's Marshall's men. Jonas Keene won't be on his own again." Clara nodded, though there was still an unnamed worry in the depths of her eyes. When Mrs. Miller left, Clara returned to Eli. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the bed, keeping the medicine bowl warm, changing his towels and listening to his breathing as if it were her own. And in a very quiet moment, Eli opened his eyes. She thought he was dreaming, but he looked at her clearly. "Are you still here?" he asked softly. Clara smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." Eli watched her. His eyes seemed deep in the firelight, as if he wanted to say something. But he only let out a long breath, as if letting go of some burden he had held for too long. He said, "Thank you for not leaving me behind." Clara took his hand. "You wouldn't leave me." Eli gave a very small smile, a rare, weak but genuine smile. "Go to sleep," he said. Clara shook her head. "I'll sit here, near you." Eli closed his eyes, his lips moving. "I am glad you are safe." Clara leaned closer to him and whispered into the space between them. "I'm safe. Because of you." The wind was blowing outside, the snow was flying. But in that little house beside the fireplace, and the man fighting to stay alive, Clara felt another door open in her heart, the door of true trust. And in that warm silence, she knew that she had just taken a big step away from the past that had imprisoned her for so many years. The next morning, the gray hills were still covered in snow, but the sky was brighter, the cloud canopy showing the first glimmers of a tentative hope. Clara stood by the window, her hands still shaking slightly from the sleepless night. In the quiet house, only Eli's steady breathing could be heard, both comfort and worry wrapped in each beat. She looked over at him, sleeping soundly on the couch. After a night of care, Eli's complexion had improved, and his breathing was no longer as labored as when he had first been wounded. But the bullet wound, though treated, was still a real wound. Every slight movement of his shoulder made Clara's heart skip a beat. She stepped closer, gently adjusting the blanket around him. In that moment she felt a change in her heart. More than gratitude, more than protection, something deeper. Something that made her realize she was no longer walking through the winters alone. The sound of horse hooves broke the silence. Clara started, her heart skipped a beat. But then a familiar voice called out from the courtyard, "Clara, it's me, Marshall Everett." She breathed out, half tired, half relieved. The door opened and snow flew in, driven by the determined footsteps of Marshall Everett and his two aides. He took off his hat, nodded to Clara, and looked around with the solemnity of a man accustomed to eventful mornings. "I heard from Mrs. Miller that something big happened last night," he said. "Yes. Jonas Keene is here," Clara replied, her voice still strained from last night. Marshall Everett looked straight at her. "Did he hurt you?" Clara shook her head. "But Eli got injured while shielding me." Marshall Everett glanced at the sleeping Eli. His face relaxed a little, as if he were silently grateful for the cowboy's bravery. "Eli Ward," he said thoughtfully. "A trustworthy man. Not many would dare face Jonas when he was desperate." Clara clenched her fists. "Can you find him? We've been tracking him since dawn. He ran into the north woods where there are some abandoned cabins. He's probably trying to get to Wyoming." Marshall bowed slightly. "But don't worry, Clara. He won't be coming back here. Not with a frozen shoulder, not in this biting cold." Clara didn't answer right away. It took a few seconds before she nodded. "I believe you." Marshall Everett turned his eyes to Eli again. "He needs rest. You need something to eat to stay awake. I'll be back when I have news." Clara saw them to the door. When it closed, the house returned to the gentle warmth of the fire. But this time, she no longer felt the lurking fear. Something new is forming. It feels like the earth after a storm, soaked but ready to sprout. Around noon, Eli woke up. Clara was sitting beside him, holding a steaming cup of herbal tea. "You're awake," she said softly. Eli narrowed his eyes slightly, then looked around as if to confirm that Jonas was no longer there. "It's okay," Clara quickly reassured. "He's gone. Marshall said they'll find him." Eli let out a long breath, like someone who had carried too much and was finally let go. "Are you not hurt?" His first question was not for himself, but for her. Clara felt her chest tighten. "I'm fine. Thanks." Eli tried to sit up, but the pain made him wince. Clara immediately supported his shoulders. "Don't try," she said. Eli looked at her, his eyes as calm as water after a strong wind. "Thank you," he said softly. Clara smiled, but her eyes were a little stinging. "Why do you always apologize and thank me?" she tried to joke. Eli replied very seriously, "Because you deserve it." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She quickly turned away to hide her emotions, but Eli saw it all. In the afternoon, Clara sat Eli in a chair near the window where the light was warmest. He looked out at the white fields, but his eyes no longer had the usual loneliness. "For years," Eli said softly, "I haven't let anyone take care of me like that." Clara bit her lip. "Why? Because grief makes you think you have to live alone." He looked straight at her. "Like you." That statement made Clara speechless. She knew he wasn't speaking to preach. He was speaking from his own wounds. "You lost someone, right?" Clara asked lightly. Eli was silent for a long moment, then said, his voice so low that Clara had to lean in to listen, "My wife and my child." Clara placed her hand on his slowly. "I'm sorry." Eli shook his head. "No need to apologize. They are the reason I seek out quiet places. The reason I don't want anyone to suffer because of me again." Clara looked at him for a long time. "But you still saved me." "Because I can't stand to see anyone get hurt anymore," Eli replied. Then he turned back to the window. "I thought I was used to the silence. But when I heard you crying last night, I realized I don't want to live in that silence anymore." Clara sat down beside him. Her heart was pounding as if awakening something that had been dormant for a long time. "Eli," she began, her voice choked. He turned, his eyes softened as if waiting for her to say something. I'm afraid that if I rely on someone again, I'll get hurt again." Eli tilted his head, his eyes as deep as the darkness of the forests where he had once braved storms alone. "I understand," he said. Clara smiled sadly. "You always understand." Eli let out a small breath, then placed his left hand, his uninjured hand, on hers. A hesitant touch at the fingertips, then more firmly. "Clara, I won't promise that I'll never let you down. I'm not perfect," he said slowly, "but I promise I'll never let you face your fears alone again." Clara felt her heart open, not with a bang, but with a warmth that spread slowly like a sprout breaking through the cold earth. "When I saw you last night," she said softly, "I was more afraid of losing you than I was of Jonas." Eli blinked. A strange emotion flashed in his eyes, pain, gentleness, and gratitude. "Clara Sutton," he said, his voice hoarse as the morning wind, "you make me want to live longer." Clara laughed, a soft, trembling laugh. She rested her forehead on his, their breaths mingling like two winters finding their spring. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered. "I'll take care of you. Until you're well. And beyond." Eli closed his eyes, his lips moving. "Then this is the first time. I want to get well soon." Clara laughed, tears rolling down her cheeks. As the sun began to set, dyeing the white fields a pale yellow, Clara and Eli sat there, two broken people now finding their place. No vows spoken aloud, no strong handshakes, no promises of the future. There was only the presence of two people, and the gentle silence of the melting snow of the west. A healing silence, a silence that belongs to them. Clara took Eli's hand gently. "You know," she said, "if it hadn't happened like that, I probably wouldn't have trusted anyone again." Eli smiled. "And if you hadn't knocked on this door on the first snow, I wouldn't have had anyone to believe in me." Clara leaned on his shoulder, avoiding her injured spot. Outside, the snow stopped falling. Inside, spring begins. Clara and Eli's story reminds us that we all have losses along the way that only we understand. But no matter how heavy the past, the human heart has the ability to regenerate when treated with kindness and respect. At any age, 60 or 70, we have the right to peace, to love, and to choose a path that makes us feel less alone. We cannot erase old wounds, but we can choose not to let them rule the rest of our lives. This story hopes to remind you that sometimes all it takes is one person who is quiet enough, patient enough, kind enough to change your whole life. Thank you for accompanying us, listening with all your empathy and life experiences. If this story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, so we have the motivation to tell more stories of healing and hope for you.